the small coastal town of Port Haven, Florida, had never seen a storm like the one that raged on July 17, 1986. Rain lashed the palm trees that lined the beachfront, bending them into painful contortions as lightning split the dark morning sky. The wind howled with such ferocity that it drowned out the emergency sirens wailing throughout the town. Inside the cramped air traffic control tower at Port Haven Municipal Airport, Michael Dawson wiped the sweat from his brow as he stared at the radar screen. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins made sleep a distant memory. The tropical storm had developed with frightening speed overnight, catching everyone off guard. Now, at 5:47 a.m., the situation had become dire. November-2-4-7-Charlie-Bravo. This is Port Haven Tower. Do you copy? I repeat, do you copy? Michael's voice betrayed the tension that had been building for the past 20 minutes. James, you need to alter your course immediately. You're heading directly into the storm cell. Static crackled through the speakers before a voice responded, distorted but recognizable. Port Haven Tower, this is Captain James Reynolds. I've got limited visibility here. Navigation systems are fluctuating, requesting vectors for immediate return. James Reynolds was one of Port Haven's own, a respected pilot with over 15 years of experience flying everything from crop dusters to commercial jets. At 42, he had settled into a comfortable routine of charter flights and flight instruction at the local airport. This morning's flight should have been routine, delivering medical supplies to Nassau and the Bahamas. He had made the trip countless times before, often joking that he could fly it blindfolded. Roger that, N247CB. Turned ahead in 290 degrees. You're approximately 70 miles southeast of our position. Michael switched channels and spoke urgently to his colleague. Sarah, call the Coast Guard. Tell them we've got a Cessna 310 in distress, entering severe weather conditions. Back in the cockpit of the twin-engine Cessna, James Reynolds fought to keep the aircraft level as it bucked violently in the turbulence. Rain hammered against the windshield with such intensity that the wipers could barely keep up. The instrument panel lights flickered ominously and the compass spun in erratic circles. Port Haven Tower, my instruments are going haywire, James reported, his experienced hands gripping the controls firmly. Compass is unreliable. GPS is cutting in and out. Despite the severity of the situation, his voice remained calm, the product of years of training and experience. He glanced at the photograph taped to his dashboard, his wife Elizabeth and their daughter Abigail, just 7 years old, smiling on the beach during last summer's vacation. The sight steeled his resolve. He had promised to take Abby fishing that weekend. It was a promise he intended to keep. The aircraft dropped suddenly, plunging several hundred feet before James could correct it. His stomach lurched as he pulled back on the yoke, fighting the powerful downdrafts that threatened to send the plane spiraling into the ocean below. November-2-4-7-Charlie-Bravo, we're losing your radar signature. Michael's voice cut through the static, tension evident in every word. What's your altitude? 4,000 feet and dropping, James replied, his focus entirely on the instruments that still functioned. Can't maintain altitude in these downdrafts. Visibility 0. He paused, calculating his options. I'm going to attempt to climb above the storm, sending to 8,000. The engines whined in protest as James pushed them to full power, pointing the nose of the aircraft upward in a desperate attempt to escape the turbulence. For a brief moment it seemed to work. The violent shaking subsided slightly as the altimeter slowly climbed. Then, without warning, a blinding flash of light filled the cockpit. The control panel went dark, followed by the sickening sound of both engines sputtering and dying. In the sudden silence, James could hear only the wind howling around the aircraft and his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Port Haven Tower, this is November-2-4-7-Charlie-Bravo. I've lost all power, all instruments. James's training kicked in as he switched to the emergency procedures ingrained in his memory. Position unknown. Attempting emergency restart and glide procedures. In the tower, Michael's knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the console. N247CB, we've lost your radar signature completely. Activate your emergency locator transmitter if possible. Coast Guard assets are being deployed to your last known coordinates. The response from the aircraft was nothing but static. James? James, do you copy? Michael called again and again, his voice rising with each attempt. But the radio remained silent, offering only the empty hiss of dead air. For 3 days, the Coast Guard conducted an extensive search of the area southeast of Port Haven, ranging deep into the notorious Bermuda Triangle where James's last transmission had originated. Debris was spotted and recovered: a seat cushion, fragments of the Cessna's distinctive white and blue tail, a logbook waterlogged beyond recognition. But of James Reynolds himself, there was no sign. On the 4th day, with the weather finally cleared, Elizabeth Reynolds stood on the dock of the Coast Guard station. Her daughter's small hand clutched tightly in hers as Commander Wilson delivered the news she had been dreading. "Mrs. Reynolds, we've exhausted all search patterns and resources. I'm deeply sorry, but we're changing the status of the operation from search and rescue to search and recovery." The officer's face reflected genuine regret. "Your husband was an experienced pilot. If anyone could have survived, it would have been him." But at this point, double quotes, Elizabeth's face remained composed, though her eyes brimmed with unshed tears. "You don't need to finish that sentence, Commander." She looked down at Abigail, whose young face registered confusion more than grief. "Thank you for your efforts." As they walked away, Abigail tugged at her mother's hand. "Mom, when is Dad coming home? He promised we'd go fishing." Elizabeth knelt down, meeting her daughter's innocent gaze. "Sweetheart, Dad's plane, There was an accident. The Coast Guard has been looking for him, but, her voice caught. The reality of having to explain death to a 7-year-old suddenly overwhelming, "But they're going to keep looking, right?" Abigail's voice was small but hopeful. "Dad always says that when you lose something, you have to keep looking until you find it." Elizabeth pulled her daughter close, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Over Abigail's shoulder, she watched as the Coast Guard cutter that had led the search pulled back into the harbor, its crew solemn-faced and weary. That night, as storm clouds gathered once more on the horizon, the small town of Port Haven added another name to the long list of those claimed by the sea and by the mysterious waters of the Bermuda Triangle. James Reynolds's beloved husband, father, and pilot was officially declared missing, presumed dead. But in the quiet darkness of their family home, 7-year-old Abigail Reynolds whispered a promise into her pillow. "I'll wait for you, Daddy. No matter how long it takes, I'll wait." It would be 35 years before that childish promise was tested in ways no one could have imagined. Abigail Reynolds Callahan stood at the window of her waterfront office, watching a small Cessna take off from Port Haven Municipal Airport. Even after all these years, she still found herself holding her breath until the aircraft was safely airborne, disappearing into the clear blue Florida sky. At 42, the same age her father had been when he vanished, Abigail had built her life around the void his disappearance had created. The law offices of Reynolds, Callahan, and Associates occupied the top floor of the most prestigious building in Port Haven, its glass walls offering panoramic views of the harbor where Coast Guard vessels still regularly patrolled. As the town's most successful maritime attorney, Abigail had spent her career advocating for the families of those lost at sea, fighting insurance companies who were all too eager to deny claims based on the mysterious circumstances often surrounding disappearances in these waters. "The Miller deposition is in 20 minutes. Her assistant, Tara, reminded her from the doorway. "And your mother called again. She wants to know if you're still coming for dinner tonight." Abigail nodded absently, her attention caught by a Coast Guard cutter returning to port. "Tell her I'll be there by 7, with wine. And don't forget it's the anniversary," Tara added gently, as if she could forget. July 17th, 2021, 35 years to the day since her father's plane had vanished without a trace. 35 years of birthdays, graduations, her wedding, the birth of her son, all marked by that persistent, hollow feeling, the knowledge that someone who should have been there was missing. Her mother, Elizabeth, had never remarried. Instead, she had channeled her grief into founding the Bermuda Triangle Family Support Group, providing counseling and legal assistance to others who had lost loved ones in similar circumstances. At 72, she remained active in the organization, though she had passed much of the day-to-day operations to younger members who brought fresh energy to the cause. Abigail gathered her briefcase and coat, preparing for the deposition. "I need to stop by the airport afterward to check on Dad's memorial plaque. Make sure it's been polished for tomorrow's ceremony." Every year on the anniversary, the family held a small, private remembrance at the airport where a bronze plaque commemorated James Reynolds and others from Port Haven who had been lost in aviation accidents. It was a tradition that had begun when Abigail was 10, and one she continued now with her own son, James, named for the grandfather he had never known. The deposition went longer than expected, a contentious affair involving the family of a fisherman who had disappeared during a sudden squall 8 months earlier. By the time Abigail pulled her car into the small lot adjacent to the Port Haven Municipal Airport, the afternoon was fading into early evening. The airport was quieter now, with only a few mechanics working on aircraft in the open hangars. "Miss Reynolds." Frank Mahoney, the aging airport manager, waved to her from the office door. He was one of the few people who still used her maiden name, having known her since childhood. "I polished up your dad's plaque this morning. Looks good as new." "Thanks, Frank." Abigail smiled warmly at the man who had been her father's friend. "I appreciate you looking after it all these years. At least I could do, Frank." Fell into step beside her as they walked toward the memorial garden at the edge of the airfield. "Your dad was the best pilot I ever knew. Never did believe he went down because of pilot error, no matter what the official report said." It was an old conversation, one they'd had many times over the years. The official investigation had eventually concluded that James Reynolds had likely become disoriented in the storm, leading to a catastrophic loss of control. But those who had known him well, Frank, Elizabeth, and a handful of other pilots, maintained that something else must have happened. Equipment failure. Extraordinary weather phenomena, something unexplainable. They reached the small garden where the bronze plaque gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Abigail ran her fingers over her father's name, the dates of his birth and presumed death, and the simple inscription beneath, "Lost to the sky, but never from our hearts." "I'll leave you be," Frank said, patting her shoulder gently. "Lock up the garden gate when you're done, will you? I need to finish the evening paperwork." Abigail nodded, grateful for the moment alone. As Frank's footsteps receded, she sat on the stone bench facing the plaque, allowing herself a rare moment of vulnerability. "Hi, Dad," she whispered. Another year gone. She talked softly, telling her father about her son's acceptance to the University of Florida, her mother's recent decision to finally sell the family home, the challenges and triumphs of her law practice. It was a one-sided conversation she'd been having for 3.5 decades, a ritual that provided more comfort than she would admit to anyone. Dusk was settling over the airport by the time she rose to leave, the runway lights blinking on in sequence. She was turning toward the gate when the sound of tires on gravel caught her attention. A taxi had pulled up at the far end of the lot, its headlights illuminating the gathering darkness. Something about the vehicle made Abigail pause, her hand on the gate latch. Perhaps it was the unusual hour for a taxi arrival. The last scheduled flight had landed hours ago. Perhaps it was simple curiosity. Whatever the reason, she found herself watching as the back door opened and a passenger emerged. Even from a distance, there was something odd about the figure that stepped onto the gravel. A man, tall and lean, dressed in clothes that seemed slightly out of place, not quite current in their style. He paid the driver and stood for a long moment, staring at the airport terminal as if seeing it for the first time. Or perhaps, Abigail thought with an inexplicable chill, as if seeing it again after a very long time. The taxi pulled away, leaving the stranger silhouetted against the darkening sky. He carried a single duffel bag, weathered and faded, which he slung over his shoulder before turning slowly in a complete circle, taking in his surroundings with deliberate attention. When his gaze landed on the memorial garden where Abigail stood frozen, he stopped. Even across the distance that separated them, she could feel the intensity of his focus, like a physical force that made the hair on her arms stand on end. The man began walking toward her, his gait steady but somehow hesitant, as if each step required careful consideration. As he drew closer, the runway lights cast his features into sharp relief, and Abigail felt her breath catch in her throat. His face was deeply lined, weathered by sun and time. His hair, once dark brown, was now mostly gray, cropped close to his head. But it was his eyes, a distinctive shade of blue that Abigail saw every day in her own mirror, that made her grip the iron gate for support. The stranger stopped a few yards away, his expression a complex mixture of emotions that Abigail couldn't begin to decipher. For a long suspended moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the distant hum of aircraft engines being tested in the hangar. Then the man cleared his throat, his voice rough with disuse or emotion, or both. "I'm looking for Elizabeth Reynolds," he said. Or Abigail. My daughter would be," he broke off, calculating. She'd be 42 now. Abigail's world tilted sharply, reality seeming to bend around the impossible figure standing before her. The resemblance was uncanny, but it couldn't be. It simply couldn't be. "Who are you?" she demanded, her attorney's training asserting itself through the shock. "What kind of sick joke is this?" The man flinched as if struck, pain flashing across his features. "No joke," he said quietly. "My name is James Reynolds. I was a pilot. I went down in a storm on July 17th, 1986. His eyes, so achingly familiar, locked with hers, and I've been trying to get home ever since." Abigail felt her knees threaten to buckle, the world spinning around her. This wasn't possible. Her father was dead, had been dead for 35 years. Yet here was a man with his eyes, his voice claiming to be him on the very anniversary of his disappearance. "My father died when his plane crashed in the Bermuda Triangle," she said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil inside her. "His body was never recovered." "Because I didn't die," the man replied simply. "I survived the crash. I've been ... away. But I'm home now." He took a tentative step forward, stopping when Abigail instinctively backed away. "You're Abigail, aren't you? My God, you look so much like your mother." The genuine wonder in his voice shook her more than anything else. This man, whoever he was, believed what he was saying. Or he was the most accomplished con artist she had ever encountered. "This is insane," Abigail whispered, more to herself than to him. "You can't be my father. You can't be." "Ask me something," he suggested gently. "Something only your father would know." Abigail's mind raced, searching for a question, a detail, something that couldn't be researched or guessed. "What did you promise me the morning you disappeared?" she finally asked. "Before you left for your flight." The man's face softened, a smile touching his lips for the first time. I promised to take you fishing when I got back. You wanted to catch a big one like in the story I always read to you, The Old Man and the Sea. You had just turned 7, and you thought you were finally old enough to handle the fishing rod by yourself. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. That detail had never been made public, had never been mentioned outside the family. It was a private memory, one she had cherished and mourned for decades. This isn't possible, she repeated, but her voice had lost its conviction. I know, the man James said with a weary nod. I can barely believe it myself, but it's me, Abby. It's really me, and I need to see your mother. I need to explain ... everything. Abigail stared at him, her legal mind already cataloging the tests that would be required. DNA comparisons, fingerprint analysis, detailed questioning about memories and experiences that couldn't be faked. But beneath the rational thoughts, a small voice, the voice of the 7-year-old girl who had promised to wait for her daddy, whispered that maybe, just maybe, miracles did happen. My mother's expecting me for dinner, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I was just about to head there. Hope flared in the man's eyes. Would it be possible for me to come with you? Or would that be too much of a shock for her? Abigail considered the question seriously. Elizabeth Reynolds was strong, but she was 72 years old. The sudden appearance of a man claiming to be her long-dead husband could be devastating, especially if he turned out to be an imposter. No, she decided firmly, I need to prepare her first. And I need to understand what's happening here before I subject her to this. She pulled out her cell phone. I'm going to call my husband. He's the chief of police in Port Haven. He'll meet us at my office. And you're going to tell us exactly where you've been for the past 35 years and how you expect us to believe you're James Reynolds. The man nodded, accepting her terms without protest. That's fair. More than fair. He gestured to the memorial garden behind her. Is that ... for me? Abigail followed his gaze to the bronze plaque bearing his name. Yes, we hold a ceremony every year on the anniversary. A shadow of deep grief passed over the man's face. I'm so sorry, Abby. If there had been any way to get word to you, to let you know I was alive ... double quotes. Save it. Abigail cut him off, unable to process the emotions his apparent sincerity was stirring in her. Save it all for when we get to my office. My husband will want to hear everything. As she led the way to her car, Abigail couldn't help noticing how the man moved with a slight limp, how his hands, when he reached for the passenger door, bore the marks of old injuries, healed but permanently etched into his skin. Whatever his story was, this man had suffered. Whether he was truly James Reynolds remained to be seen, but his pain at least was genuine. The drive to her office was conducted in tense silence, the man beside her staring out at the changed landscape of Port Haven with undisguised wonder. 35 years had transformed the once small coastal town into a thriving city, with high-rises along the waterfront and sprawling developments where once there had been only marshland and a few scattered homes. It's so different, he murmured at one point, almost to himself, almost unrecognizable. Abigail said nothing, focusing on driving and on the phone call she would soon have to make to her mother, explaining why she would be late for dinner, and perhaps preparing her for a shock beyond anything they could have imagined. As she pulled into the parking garage beneath her office building, Abigail found herself wondering if she was making a terrible mistake. What if this man was dangerous? What if his resemblance to her father was just a cruel coincidence, and his knowledge of private details the result of some elaborate research? But as she glanced at his profile, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights of the garage, she couldn't deny the truth that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Whatever else this man might be, he was indeed the spitting image of James Reynolds, aged appropriately for the 35 years that had passed, but unmistakably him. My husband will meet us upstairs, she said, leading the way to the private elevator that would take them directly to her office suite. His name is Daniel Callahan. He's been chief of police here for 7 years. The man nodded, absorbing this information along with everything else. You married a police officer. That seems fitting somehow. Abigail raised an eyebrow. Why is that? A hint of the smile she remembered from childhood touched his lips. You always did have a strong sense of justice, even as a little girl. Remember how you used to insist that we release the smallest fish we caught? They deserve a chance to grow up, you would say. Another memory, another detail that cut through her defenses. Abigail found herself fighting back tears as the elevator doors opened onto her office floor. Daniel was already waiting in the reception area, his expression shifting from concern to alert wariness as he took in the stranger accompanying his wife. At 50, Daniel Callahan remained physically imposing, his years on the force having honed rather than diminished his natural authority. Abby, he greeted her, his eyes never leaving the older man. What's going on? Your message said it was urgent. Abigail took a deep breath, still unsure how to explain the inexplicable. Daniel, this man claims to be. He says he's my father. James Reynolds. Daniel's expression hardened, his posture straightening as his hand instinctively moved closer to where his service weapon would normally be holstered. Is that right? He asked, his tone carefully neutral but with an underlying edge of steel. And where exactly have you been for the past 35 years, Mr. Reynolds? The older man met Daniel's gaze steadily. That's a long story, Chief Callahan. One I'm prepared to tell, though I'm not sure you'll believe it. I'm not sure I would in your position. Try me, Daniel replied, gesturing toward Abigail's office. We've got all night. As they settled into the spacious corner office with its views of the harbor now, lit by the lights of boats and buildings, Abigail found herself studying the man who claimed to be her father with a mixture of suspicion, hope, and fear. Whatever story he was about to tell would either heal or reopen wounds that had never fully closed. The man James sat in the visitor's chair, his weathered duffel bag placed carefully at his feet. He took a deep breath, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, and began to speak. My plane went down approximately 70 miles southeast of Port Haven, in what people call the Bermuda Triangle. The storm was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. The instruments failed, the engines died, and I lost all radio contact. I managed to ditch in the ocean and deploy the life raft before the Cessna sank. His voice was steady, recounting the events as if they had happened yesterday rather than decades ago. I drifted for 3 days before I was picked up not by the Coast Guard or a passing ship, but by a vessel I didn't recognize. The crew spoke Spanish, but with an accent I couldn't place. They seemed surprised to find me, almost as if they hadn't expected anyone to be out there. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. This is where my story becomes difficult to believe. The ship was called the El Kaluk, and when I asked where we were headed, they told me home. I assumed they meant their home port, somewhere in the Caribbean or South America. But when we finally docked, I found myself in a country I didn't recognize, with technology and customs that seemed out of place. Daniel exchanged a skeptical glance with Abigail. What country was this exactly? That's just it. They never gave it a name that I recognized. The people called it simply La Tierra de Niebla, the land of mist. It was isolated, cut off from the outside world by geography and strict governmental control. No outside communications, no visitors allowed to leave. James leaned forward, his expression earnest. I spent 35 years there, working as a mechanic and later as a pilot for their small air force, always trying to find a way home. You expect us to believe that you were held captive in some unnamed country for 3.5 decades. Daniel's disbelief was evident. Without any attempt to contact your family or the U.S. government? I made many attempts, James replied, his voice hardening slightly, all of which were intercepted. Letters never sent, radio messages jammed, escape attempts punished severely. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a web of old scars that crisscrossed his forearm. These were from my second attempt to steal a plane. After the third try, they kept me under house arrest for 5 years. Abigail found herself staring at the scars. Undeniable evidence of suffering. If this place was so isolated and controlling, how'd you finally get out? James's expression shifted, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face. Revolution, he said simply. The younger generation had been secretly communicating with the outside world through improvised radio equipment. When they finally rose up against the government, the borders were temporarily opened. A group of U.S. foreigners who had been stranded there for various reasons seized the opportunity. We made our way to Venezuela, and from there I worked passage on ships, taking whatever jobs I could find to earn enough for a ticket home. And you have proof of this? Daniel pressed. Documentation, witnesses, anything to corroborate your story? James reached for his duffel bag, pulling out a weathered passport that he handed to Daniel. This was issued to me by the Venezuelan government 3 months ago, after I presented my case to their authorities. They were skeptical, to say the least, but they eventually believed enough of my story to issue temporary documentation. Daniel examined the passport carefully. This appears legitimate, but it doesn't prove you're James Reynolds. Just that someone with this name received Venezuelan documentation. I know, James acknowledged. I expected skepticism. That's why I'm prepared to submit to any tests you deem necessary: DNA, fingerprints, detailed questioning about my life before the crash. Whatever it takes to prove to you and to Elizabeth that I am who I say I am. Abigail, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion, finally spoke up. This country you were in, why have we never heard of it? How could a place be so isolated in the modern world? James smiled sadly. I ask myself that question every day for 35 years. The best answer I can give is that there are still places on this earth that exist in their own reality outside the connected world, Places where time moves differently, where isolation isn't just geographic but ideological. That sounds like something from a fantasy novel, Daniel observed dryly. I'm not claiming anything supernatural, James clarified quickly. Just a political reality that's hard for Americans to comprehend. Think North Korea, but even more secluded, with less interest in projecting power beyond its borders. Abigail stood abruptly, unable to remain still any longer. I need to call my mother. She needs to be part of this conversation. Abby, wait, Daniel cautioned. Let's establish some facts first. We don't want to put your mother through an emotional ringer if this turns out to be a hoax. A con? James finished for him, no anger in his voice, only understanding. I agree completely, Chief Callahan. Elizabeth has suffered enough because of my disappearance. I wouldn't want to cause her more pain with false hope. The calm reasonableness of this response gave both Abigail and Daniel pause. It was not the reaction of someone intent on a scam or seeking attention. I'll call the station, Daniel decided, pulling out his phone. Have them send over a fingerprinting kit. We can at least verify if your prints match those on file for James Reynolds. Thank you, James said sincerely. And perhaps while we wait, I could ask about you both. About Elizabeth. About the life that continued while I was away. His question, so simple yet loaded with decades of loss, struck Abigail to the core. How did one summarize 35 years of life to someone who had missed it all? Where would she even begin? As if reading her thoughts, James added gently, just the highlights, perhaps. The important things. I have a lifetime to learn the details if I'm allowed to be part of your lives again. The humility in his request. The acknowledgement that he had no right to expect a place in their lives after so long shifted something in Abigail's perception. Whoever this man was, her father or an extraordinarily convincing impostor, he understood the magnitude of what he was asking. I'll tell you about Mom, she said finally, returning to her seat, and about my son, your grandson. His name is James, after you. He's 19 now, studying aerospace engineering at the University of Florida. For the first time, James Reynolds, if that's truly who he was, lost his composure completely, tears filling his eyes and spilling down his weathered cheeks. You named your son after me, he whispered, his voice breaking. It's even though you thought I was dead. Especially because we thought you were dead, Abigail corrected, her own eyes growing damp despite her best efforts. Mom and I, we never wanted to forget. Never wanted to let go of the man you were. In the silence that followed, the question hung unspoken between them. Was he still that man? Could he ever be again? Or had 35 years in a strange land changed? James Reynolds beyond recognition, just as 35 years of grief and resilience had transformed the family he had left behind. The answers would come, but not tonight. Tonight was for questions, for tentative steps toward a truth that might prove more extraordinary than any of them could imagine. And as Abigail watched the man who might be her father struggling to compose himself, she found herself hoping, against all logic and legal training, that sometimes the impossible could be true. The conference room at the Port Haven Police Department buzzed with tension the following morning. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the assembled group. Daniel standing near the door with arms crossed. Dr. Miranda Chun, the county medical examiner who had agreed to oversee the DNA testing. Elizabeth Reynolds, sitting rigid and pale at the far end of the table. And Abigail, positioned protectively next to her mother. They were waiting for the man claiming to be James Reynolds, who was currently providing fingerprint and DNA samples in an adjacent room. Mom, are you sure you're up for this? Abigail asked softly, noting the tremor in her mother's hands. We could have waited for the test results before bringing you in. Elizabeth shook her head firmly. I've waited 35 years, Abigail. I'm not waiting another day. She smoothed her silver hair, tucked neatly into the elegant bun she had worn for as long as her daughter could remember. Besides, I'll know. The moment I see him, I'll know if it's really James. Daniel caught Abigail's eye across the room, his expression conveying concern. They had discussed this late into the night, the psychological impact this situation could have on Elizabeth, regardless of whether the man proved to be James Reynolds or not. The door opened, and Officer Peterson ushered in the subject of their discussion. The man who called himself James Reynolds had shaved and changed clothes since the previous night, now wearing a simple button-down shirt and slacks that Daniel had provided. The transformation made him look even more like the man in the old photographs that had occupied a place of honor in the Reynolds household for decades. Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath echoed in the quiet room. She rose slowly to her feet, one hand gripping the edge of the conference table for support. James? Her voice was barely audible, a whisper laden with disbelief and fragile hope. The man stopped in the doorway, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth with an intensity that seemed to exclude everyone else in the room. Lizzie, he said, using the nickname that only her husband had ever used. You're even more beautiful than I remembered. Elizabeth took a halting step forward, then another, her gaze never leaving his face. When she was just a few feet away, she stopped, her eyes searching his features as if memorizing every line, every change that time had wrought. Your eyes, she said softly. They're the same. But everything else, 35 years is a long time, he acknowledged, making no move to touch her, seeming to understand that she needed space. For both of us. Elizabeth reached out a trembling hand, her fingers stopping just short of his face. May I? He nodded, standing perfectly still as she laid her palm against his cheek, her touch feather-light as if she feared he might dissolve beneath her fingers. Your scar is gone, she noted, her thumb tracing the spot above his right eyebrow where James Reynolds had carried a small crescent-shaped scar since childhood. The one from when you fell out of the apple tree when you were 10. The man stiffened slightly, his brow furrowing. It faded over time. The doctors in La Tiara were skilled with certain treatments. Abigail and Daniel exchanged glances. It was a small detail, but potentially significant. Elizabeth let her hand drop, taking a step back. The brief flash of hope in her eyes had dimmed. I see. Dr. Chun cleared her throat. I've just received the preliminary fingerprint results from our database, she announced, looking up from her tablet. They're not a match to the prints we have on file for James Reynolds from his pilot's license in military service. A heavy silence fell over the room. The man calling himself James paled visibly, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time. That's impossible, he insisted. I am James Reynolds. There must be an error in your records. Or perhaps ... or perhaps you're not who you claim to be, Daniel finished, his tone hardening. Care to explain why your fingerprints don't match those of the real James Reynolds? The man's eyes darted between them, a hint of desperation entering his expression. The work I did, years of handling chemicals, mechanical repairs, and harsh conditions. It's possible my fingerprints were altered. Fingerprints don't change that dramatically. Even with environmental damage, Dr. Chun stated flatly. And yours aren't damaged, they're simply different patterns altogether. Elizabeth had returned to her seat, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Who are you? She asked quietly. Why are you doing this? The man, no longer James in their minds, sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. I am James Reynolds, he insisted, though with less conviction than before. I was born in Lakeland, Florida, on March 12, 1944. I served in the Air Force from 1966 to 1974. I married Elizabeth Ann Carrington on June 8, 1977. Our daughter, Abigail Grace Reynolds, was born on May 29, 1979. Anyone could research those facts, Abigail pointed out, fighting to keep the anger from her voice. They're all public record. Ask me something that isn't, he challenged, a hint of desperation entering his tone. Ask me anything about our life together, Lizzie. About the house on Maple Street. About the time we got caught in that thunderstorm on our first date and had to take shelter in that abandoned boathouse. Ask me about the night Abby was born. How the power went out in the hospital and I held a flashlight for the doctor. Elizabeth's expression flickered, uncertainty clouding her features. These were indeed private details, memories she had cherished over the long years of widowhood. Daniel stepped forward, his police training taking over. Sir, I need to be clear about something. Impersonating someone for the purpose of deception or fraud is a serious offense. If you're not James Reynolds, you need to tell us who you really are and why you're here. The man buried his face in his hands, his next words muffled but clear enough to hear. I don't know how to prove it to you. I am James. I've spent 35 years fighting to get back to my family. And now that I'm here, you don't believe me. Dr. Chun's tablet chimed with an incoming message. She read it quickly, her expression grave. The DNA comparison to samples we have from James Reynolds, Jr. The grandson shows no familial match. This man is not related to your family, Abigail. The finality of the statement hung in the air like a death knell. Abigail felt a complex mixture of emotions, disappointment, anger, but also a strange relief. The impossible had remained impossible after all. The world still made sense, even if that sense was painful. Elizabeth rose from her chair, her dignity intact despite the emotional turmoil she must have been feeling. I would like to go home now, she said quietly. Abigail, would you drive me, please? Of course, Mom. Abigail moved to her mother's side, placing a supportive arm around her shoulders. Wait, the man pleaded, rising to his feet. Please, just wait, I can explain. There's more to this story than you know. Daniel stepped between him and the Reynolds women. Sir, you'll have plenty of time to explain to me. At the station. Right now, I think you need to come with us and answer some serious questions about who you really are and what you're doing in Port Haven. For a moment, it seemed the man might resist, might try to follow Elizabeth and Abigail, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. All right, he agreed wearily. I'll come with you. But I'm telling you, there's an explanation for all of this. As Abigail led her mother from the room, she glanced back one last time at the man who had briefly made her believe in miracles. Their eyes met across the distance, and in his gaze she saw something that gave her pause. Not guilt or the calculation of a con artist, but a deep, genuine grief that mirrored what she had carried in her own heart for 35 years. Outside in the parking lot, Elizabeth stood in the bright July sunlight, her face tilted upward as if seeking warmth after a long winter. Are you okay, Mom? Abigail asked gently, unlocking her car with the remote. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment before answering. You know what's strange, Abigail? For a moment, just a moment, when he first walked in, I believed it was him. Something in the way he looked at me, ... It was so like James. She shook her head slowly. But your father had a small scar above his right eyebrow. He got it falling out of the Williamson's apple tree when he was a boy. I used to tease him about it, tell him it was shaped like a crescent moon, that man in there. He didn't have it. Abigail helped her mother into the passenger seat, processing this information. The scar's important to you. It's not about the scar itself, Elizabeth explained as Abigail slid behind the wheel. It's about knowing someone so intimately that you notice even the smallest. Your father and I were married for 9 years before he disappeared. I knew every inch of him. Her voice softened with memory. That's how love works, Abby. The real kind, anyway. As they drove through Port Haven toward Elizabeth's comfortable bungalow overlooking the harbor, Abigail found herself wondering about the man they had left behind. Who was he, really? What possible motive could someone have for such an elaborate deception? He knew things, though, Abigail said almost to herself. Private things about our family. Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. Yes, he did. More than someone should have been able to research. She gazed out the window at the familiar streets passing by. That's what makes me wonder if there isn't more to his story, even if he isn't James. Back at the police station, Daniel Callahan sat across from the man now being held for questioning, a recorder placed between them on the table. Let's start with your real name, Daniel suggested, his tone professional but not unkind. Years of police work had taught him that hostility rarely produced useful information. The man looked up, his expression resolute despite the defeat evident in the slump of his shoulders. My real name is James Reynolds. I was born in 1944 in Lakeland, Florida. I disappeared when my plane went down in the Bermuda Triangle on July 17, 1986. Daniel sighed, recognizing the signs of someone who intended to stick to their story regardless of evidence to the contrary. We've already established that your fingerprints and DNA don't match those of James Reynolds. Continuing this charade only makes your situation worse. I understand how this looks, the man replied, leaning forward slightly, but I'm asking you to consider a possibility that goes beyond the normal explanation. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. What if the place I was taken to, La Tierra de Niebla, wasn't just isolated politically? What if it exists, adjacent to our reality? Daniel's expression remained neutral, though internally he was calculating whether to add psychological evaluation to this man's processing. Adjacent to our reality, he repeated flatly. You're suggesting what exactly? A parallel dimension? I'm not sure what to call it, the man admitted. The locals had legends about their homeland existing in El Espacio Entre, the space between. They believed their island existed at the intersection of multiple realities, accessible only through certain points in the ocean that they called Las Puertas, the doors. So now you're claiming you traveled through some kind of interdimensional portal in the Bermuda Triangle, Daniel summarized. That's your explanation for why your DNA doesn't match James Reynolds? I know how it sounds, the man acknowledged, frustration evident in his voice. But I'm telling you what I experienced. In La Tierra, there were others like me, people who had disappeared from various places around the world, particularly from regions like the Bermuda Triangle, and all of us, ... We were slightly different from what we remembered. Small changes in appearance and physical characteristics. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. Either this was an exceptionally committed con artist with a detailed backstory, or he was dealing with someone experiencing delusions. Neither option explained the man's knowledge of the Reynolds family's private history. Let's set aside the interdimensional travel theory for a moment, Daniel suggested pragmatically. How did you come to know such specific details about James Reynolds and his family? Details that aren't in public records. The man's expression turned somber. Because I lived them, Chief Callahan. They're my memories, my experiences. He hesitated, then added, though I admit, some of them might be different from what Elizabeth and Abigail remember, just as I am physically different in small ways from the James Reynolds they knew. Daniel considered his next approach carefully. He had dealt with enough unstable individuals over his career to recognize that confrontation would likely prove counterproductive, but he also couldn't ignore the potential threat this man might pose to the Reynolds family if his obsession with them continued. I'm going to hold you for 48 hours while we verify your identity and determine if charges should be filed, Daniel informed him. In the meantime, I'm ordering you to stay away from Elizabeth and Abigail Reynolds. No contact whatsoever. Is that clear? The man nodded slowly, resignation settling over his features. I understand. But please, before you lock me up, will you at least look into La Tierra de Niebla? Talk to experts on the Bermuda Triangle? There have been other cases, other people who returned changed, in small but significant ways. I'll have my officers conduct a thorough investigation, Daniel assured him, though he had little intention of wasting department resources on wild goose chases involving parallel dimensions. His priority was protecting his family and identifying this man's true identity and intentions. After the man had been escorted to a holding cell, Daniel returned to his office and initiated a nationwide search for missing persons who matched the subject's description and approximate age. He also reached out to the FBI to check if anyone matching this description was on their watch list or had a history of similar deceptive behavior. By late afternoon, Abigail had returned to the station, leaving Elizabeth in the care of close friends from her support group. How is she? Daniel asked as his wife entered his office, closing the door behind her. Shaken, but handling it better than I expected, Abigail replied, sinking into the chair opposite his desk. She's Elizabeth Reynolds. She doesn't fall apart easily. She rubbed her temples, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. What did he say? You get any sense of who he really is or what he wants? Daniel hesitated, unsure how much of the man's bizarre claims to share. He's sticking to his story about being your father, despite the evidence. But he's added some unusual elements to his explanation. Unusual how? Abigail pressed. He's claiming that the place he was taken to after his plane crashed exists in some kind of parallel dimension, Daniel explained, watching his wife's reaction carefully. He says that's why his DNA and fingerprints don't match, because he's a version of James Reynolds from a slightly different reality than ours. Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless. That's insane. Yes, it is, Daniel agreed. Which means we're either dealing with someone who's mentally ill or someone who's gone to extraordinary lengths to craft an unverifiable backstory. Abigail shook her head slowly, processing this new information. But why? What could he possibly hope to gain? Mom doesn't have significant assets. The support group operates on donations and grants. There's nothing to inherit. No insurance policy waiting to be claimed. Maybe it's not about money, Daniel suggested. Some people crave attention, notoriety. Imagine the headlines. Man returns after 35 years lost in the Bermuda Triangle. It would be a sensation, but he hasn't sought publicity, Abigail pointed out. He came directly to us privately. If it were about attention, wouldn't he have gone to the media first? Daniel had to acknowledge the logic in her argument. True. Which leaves us with two other possibilities. Either he genuinely believes he's James Reynolds, suffering from some form of delusional disorder, or he has some other motive we haven't identified yet. Abigail was quiet for a moment, her legal mind working through the possibilities. What about his belongings? That duffel bag he carried, did you search it? Yes, with his consent, Daniel confirmed. Nothing unusual, some clothes, basic toiletries. A journal written in Spanish that appears to detail his journey from Venezuela to the United States, and about $2,000 in cash. No weapons, no contraband. Nothing to suggest ill intent. I want to see the journal, Abigail decided. My Spanish is rusty, but I might catch something your officers missed. Daniel hesitated. Abby, are you sure that's a good idea? This man has already caused enough emotional turmoil for your family. I need to understand. Daniel, she insisted, her jaw set in the determined expression he knew all too well. If there's even the smallest chance that there's some truth to his story, not the parallel dimension nonsense, but something that explains how he knows so much about our family, I need to find it. For Mom's sake and for mine. Recognizing the futility of arguing with his wife when she had made up her mind, Daniel nodded. All right, I'll have Officer Martinez bring the journal to my office. But I want you to read it here, not alone. While they waited, Abigail paced the small office, her thoughts churning. Has the DNA test come back yet? The detailed one? Not just the preliminary comparison? Dr. Chun is expediting it, but it will still be at least 24 hours, Daniel replied, though I don't expect it to contradict the initial findings. Abigail nodded absently, her gaze distant. You know, when I was a little girl after Dad disappeared, I used to have this recurring dream. Her voice softened with the memory. In the dream, he would come walking up our driveway just like any other day, as if he'd never been gone. And when I'd run to him asking where he'd been all this time, he would always say the same thing. I got lost in the mist, Abby. But I found my way back. Daniel watched his wife carefully, understanding the emotional weight this situation carried for her. Dreams are how children process loss, he said gently. They're a way of keeping hope alive when reality is too painful to accept. I know, Abigail acknowledged. But here's the thing, Daniel, when that man said he had been in a place called La Tierra de Niebla, the land of mists, something about it resonated with me. Abigail took it carefully, running her fingers over the worn leather cover before opening it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, filling the pages with Spanish text interspersed with occasional diagrams and sketches. Abigail began reading slowly, translating as she went. Day 1 of freedom, she read aloud. After 35 years in exile, I have finally crossed the border. Venezuela is not home, but it is the first step on my journey back to Elizabeth and Abigail. If they still live, if they remember me, if they can forgive my absence, double quotes, she continued reading in silence, her brow furrowing with concentration as she turned page after page. The journal documented a difficult journey through South America, working odd jobs, saving money for passage to the United States, all driven by a single-minded determination to return to Port Haven. There's no mention of parallel dimensions or interdimensional travel, Abigail noted after nearly an hour of reading. He writes about La Tierra as if it's a physical place, an isolated country or community. He describes the revolution, the opening of borders, his escape with others who had been collected from various parts of the world. Collected? Daniel repeated, his interest piqued. What does he mean by that? Abigail flipped back through the pages, finding the relevant passage. He says the people of La Tierra believed they had a special purpose to collect and preserve individuals who would otherwise be lost. There's a reference to them considering themselves Los Guardians de los Perdidos, the Guardians of the Lost. Sounds like some kind of cult, Daniel observed. That would explain a lot. The isolation, the prevention of outside communication, the indoctrination. Maybe, Abigail conceded, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. But listen to this entry from about 2 months ago. I wonder if they will recognize me. The changes are subtle but real. Dr. Vega says it is a natural effect of crossing between worlds, that everyone who comes to La Tiara and returns experiences these small alterations. I pray that Elizabeth will see past the differences to the man beneath, the husband who has loved her every day of these 35 years. Daniel frowned. That supports his parallel dimension claim. But it could also be the writing of someone who's been influenced by cult beliefs or who's experiencing delusion. Abigail closed the journal thoughtfully. There's something here, Daniel, something we're missing. This isn't the writing of a con artist or someone suffering from mental illness. It's too coherent, too detailed, too emotionally authentic. What are you suggesting? Daniel asked, sensing that his wife was moving toward a conclusion he might not like. Abigail met his gaze steadily. I'm not suggesting anything supernatural or science fictional, but I am saying that there might be elements of truth in his story. Maybe not a parallel dimension, but perhaps some isolated community that has been collecting people who disappear in places like the Bermuda Triangle. Maybe for research, maybe for some misguided humanitarian purpose. Daniel considered this theory, finding it somewhat more plausible than interdimensional travel, though still highly speculative. Even if such a place existed, it doesn't explain the DNA and fingerprint mismatches. Those are biological facts, not subjective perceptions. No, it doesn't, Abigail admitted, frustration evident in her tone. Less double quotes, she trailed off, her expression shifting as a new possibility occurred to her. Unless what? Daniel prompted. Unless he's not my father, but someone who knew him, Abigail suggested slowly, the idea taking shape as she spoke. What if my father really did survive the crash, was taken to this place, this La Tiara, and met this man there? What if they became friends and my father told him everything about us, showed him pictures, shared memories? And then, when my father died, maybe recently, this man promised to find us, to deliver a message, or simply to let us know what really happened. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That would explain his emotional investment and his knowledge of your family. It might even explain why he's so committed to the idea that he is James Reynolds. Perhaps your father asked him to deliver the message in person, as if it were coming from him directly. It's still a stretch, Abigail acknowledged. But it makes more sense than parallel dimensions or a complex con with no apparent payoff. There's one way to find out, Daniel said, rising from his desk. Let's go ask him directly. No accusations, no skepticism, just a straightforward question. Were you friends with the real James Reynolds? As they made their way to the holding cells, Abigail felt a strange mixture of emotions. Hope that they might finally uncover the truth, fear of what that truth might be, and a lingering sense that they were on the verge of discovering something that would change their understanding of the world in profound ways. The man who claimed to be James Reynolds was sitting on the edge of the cell's narrow cot when they arrived, his head in his hands. He looked up as they approached, his expression brightening slightly at the sight of Abigail. You came back, he said simply. I have a question for you, Abigail replied, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions beneath the surface. A different question, one I should have asked from the beginning. The man nodded, waiting. Did you know my father in this place you call La Tierra de Niebla? Abigail asked directly. Were you friends with the real James Reynolds? And did he ask you to find us, to tell us what happened to him? A flicker of understanding crossed the man's face, followed by a sad smile. Ah, I see. You're looking for an explanation that fits within your understanding of reality. He stood, approaching the bars that separated them. It's a reasonable theory, Abby. More reasonable than the truth. But no, I wasn't friends with James Reynolds. I am James Reynolds, just not exactly the one you remember. Abigail felt a surge of frustration. The DNA test shows I'm not related to your son, he finished for her. And the fingerprints don't match what you have on record. I know. But consider this. What if the changes that occur when someone crosses between worlds aren't just superficial? What if they extend to the cellular level, to the very building blocks of who we are? Daniel stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. Mr. Whoever you are, we're trying to find a rational explanation for this situation, one that doesn't involve science fiction concepts. The man regarded Daniel with surprising compassion. Chief Callahan, I understand your skepticism. In your position, I'd feel the same. But sometimes the truth isn't rational, or as Lee explained. He turned his attention back to Abigail. There's one thing I haven't mentioned yet, one piece of evidence that might convince you. What's that? Abigail asked, unable to keep a note of weariness from her voice. The music box, he said quietly. The one I gave you on your 7th birthday, just a week before I disappeared. It was carved from olive wood with a tiny ballerina inside that danced to Claire de Lune. You kept it on your nightstand and would wind it every night before bed. You told me once that when I was away on flights, the music helped you feel like I was still there, watching over you. Abigail froze, her breath catching in her throat. The music box had indeed been her most treasured possession as a child, a gift from her father that she had guarded fiercely until it was destroyed in a house fire when she was 16. But unlike her father's promise to take her fishing, the music box had never been mentioned in news articles or interviews. It had been a private, personal connection between father and daughter. "How could you possibly know about that?" she whispered. "Because I gave it to you," he replied simply. "I remember the look on your face when you opened it, like you'd been given all the magic in the world in one small box. You named the ballerina Claire after the song." Abigail felt the certainty she had been clinging to begin to crumble. This detail was too specific, too intimate to have been researched or guessed, yet the scientific evidence remained irrefutable. This man's DNA did not match that of her family. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted, her voice barely audible. The man reached through the bars, not touching her, but offering his open palm a gesture of peace, of connection. "Believe what your heart tells you, Abby. The world is stranger and more wonderful than any of us can fully comprehend. Sometimes we have to embrace mystery, even when it defies explanation." Daniel placed a protective hand on Abigail's shoulder, gently drawing her back from the cell. "I think that's enough for today," he said firmly. "We'll continue this conversation tomorrow, after we've all had time to rest and think." As they turned to leave, the man called after them. "Abigail," she paused, looking back over her shoulder, "ask your mother about the promise I made her the night before my last flight, the thing I said I'd do when I returned. She never told anyone about it, not even you. If she tells you, and it matches what I remember, will you at least consider the possibility that I'm telling the truth?" Abigail didn't respond, but as she walked away with Daniel, the question echoed in her mind. What promise could her father have made that was so private, so significant that her mother had kept it secret for 35 years? And if this man knew it, if his memory matched her mother's, what then? The sun was setting over Port Haven as Abigail and Daniel drove to Elizabeth's house, casting long shadows across the familiar streets. Neither spoke much during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts about the extraordinary situation they found themselves in. Elizabeth was waiting for them on her porch, a glass of iced tea in hand, looking out over the harbor as the fishing boats returned for the evening. She smiled as they approached, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. "I thought you might come by," she said, pouring additional glasses for them from a pitcher on the small table. "I've been sitting here thinking about him, about the man who claims to be James." Abigail sat beside her mother, choosing her words carefully. "Mom, he mentioned something I wanted to ask you about. He said Dad made you a promise the night before his last flight, something private that you never told anyone about. Is that true?" Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly, causing the ice in her glass to clink. "He told you about the promise?" Her voice had an odd quality, somewhere between wonder and fear. "No," Abigail clarified quickly. "He just said there was one. He said if you told me what it was and it matched his memory, we should consider the possibility that he's telling the truth." Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, gazing out at the darkening water, the lighthouse on the point beginning its nightly vigil. "The night before James left on that flight," she finally said, her voice soft with memory, "we stayed up late talking about the future. Abby, you have to understand, your father and I had been discussing having another child. We'd been trying for almost a year with no success." This was news to Abigail, who had never heard her mother mention wanting a sibling for her. That night, Elizabeth continued, "James promised that when he returned from his trip to Nassau, we would look into adoption. He said that there were children in the world who needed homes, and we had love to give. He even suggested a name if we adopted a boy. Samuel, after his grandfather." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It was the last conversation we ever had. I never told anyone because after he disappeared it seemed like just another broken promise, another future that would never be." Abigail reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry, Mom. I had no idea." Elizabeth turned to her, a strange light in her eyes. "Abigail, there's no way anyone could have known about that conversation. James and I were alone in our bedroom. We never discussed it with anyone else. If this man knows about the adoption plan, about the name Samuel ... It still doesn't explain the DNA and fingerprint mismatches," Daniel pointed out gently. "The science is clear on that point." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "I know. And yet ... She rose from her chair, moving to the edge of the porch where the last rays of sunlight bathed her face in golden light. "All these years, I've been helping families find closure after losing loved ones in the Bermuda Triangle. I've heard every theory, every explanation, from the scientific to the supernatural. Most of them are nonsense, of course. But there have been cases, rare documented cases of people returning changed in subtle ways. Different blood types, altered fingerprints, small physical differences that can't be explained." "Mom," Abigail said carefully, "are you saying you believe his story about parallel dimensions?" Elizabeth turned back to face them, her expression resolute. "I'm saying I don't know what to believe anymore. But I do know this. I want to hear what he has to say about the promise. I want to look into his eyes when he tells me. And then I'll decide whether he's James or not." As night fell over Port Haven, three people sat in silence on a porch overlooking the harbor, each contemplating a question that challenged the very foundations of their understanding of reality. Could a man return from the Bermuda Triangle after 35 years, changed yet somehow still the same? And if so, what did that mean for all the other mysteries of the world that had been dismissed as impossible, yet persistently refused to be explained away? The answer, like the man himself, existed in that uncertain space between known and unknown, a territory as vast and mysterious as the waters of the Bermuda Triangle itself. The morning dawned clear and bright, with no hint of the storm that had raged 35 years earlier. Elizabeth Reynolds stood in the visitors' area of the Port Haven Police Department, her posture straight and dignified despite the emotional turmoil visible in her eyes. Beside her, Abigail watched with a mixture of concern and curiosity as the door opened and the man claiming to be James Reynolds was escorted in by Officer Martinez. Daniel had arranged for this meeting in a private room rather than the holding cell, a gesture of respect for Elizabeth's feelings regardless of the man's true identity. The room was simple but comfortable, a small table, 4 chairs, and windows that let in the morning sunlight. 10 minutes, Daniel reminded them quietly. I'll be right outside if you need me. As the door closed behind him, leaving the three of them alone, a heavy silence fell over the room. The man stood uncertainly, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth with an expression of such longing that Abigail found herself looking away, feeling as if she were intruding on something deeply personal. Please sit, Elizabeth finally said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the emotion that Abigail knew must be churning beneath her controlled exterior. The man sat down slowly, placing his hands on the table, palms down, fingers spread, a gesture of openness, of having nothing to hide. Abigail tells me you mentioned a promise, Elizabeth began without preamble. A private conversation between James and me the night before his last flight. He nodded, a sad smile touching his lips. We were sitting on the back porch after Abby had gone to bed. You were wearing that blue robe I gave you for Christmas with your hair down around your shoulders. The cicadas were so loud that night, remember? Like the whole world was humming around us. Elizabeth's composure wavered slightly at these details, but she pressed on. What did we talk about? What was the promise? We talked about expanding our family, he replied, his voice soft with memory, about how we'd been trying for another baby, but it wasn't happening. I told you that maybe there was another path for us, that there were children in the world who needed homes, who needed the kind of love we had to give. I promised that when I got back from Nassau, we would look into adoption agencies. He paused, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. I suggested the name Samuel if we adopted a boy after my grandfather. You liked that, but you said you'd want his middle name to be Thomas, after your father. Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet room. The detail about the middle name Thomas had not been mentioned in her conversation with Abigail and Daniel the previous evening. There's more, the man continued, his voice gaining confidence. You were worried about how Abby would react to a new child in the family, especially one who came to us older, not as a baby. You were concerned she might feel her place was threatened, but I told you how I'd seen her with the Martinez kids next door, how natural she was with them, how nurturing. I said she had enough love in her heart for 10 siblings. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. James, she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a prayer. How is this possible? They say you're not him, that the DNA, the fingerprints, ... double quotes. I know, he acknowledged. And I can't explain it in any way that makes scientific sense. All I can tell you is what happened to me. He leaned forward, his eyes intense with the need to be understood. When my plane went down, I should have died. By all logic, all reason, I should have perished in those waters. But something happened in that storm, Lizzie. Something I still don't fully comprehend. Abigail found herself holding her breath, caught up in the sheer conviction in the man's voice. The people who found me, who rescued me from the life raft after 3 days adrift, they had a saying. Las puertas se abren para los que están destinados a pasar. The doors open for those who are meant to pass through. His voice took on an almost hypnotic quality as he continued. They believe that certain places in the world, the Bermuda Triangle, the Devil's Sea off Japan, a few others were thresholds between different versions of reality. That sometimes rarely people could pass through these thresholds, especially in moments of crisis or great need. Different versions of reality, Elizabeth repeated, neither accepting nor rejecting the concept. You're saying you ... crossed over into a different dimension? Or a different timeline, a parallel world? The terminology doesn't matter, he replied. What matters is that in crossing, small changes occurred. My fingerprints, my DNA, subtle aspects of my physical appearance, all slightly altered from what they were in this world. But my memories, my feelings, the core of who I am, that remained unchanged. Abigail, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. If what you're saying is true, then you're not exactly our James Reynolds. You're a version of him from somewhere else. The man turned to her, his expression softening. I'm still your father, Abby. Still the man who taught you to ride a bicycle in the church parking lot because it had the smoothest pavement in town. Still the man who held you when you had nightmares about the monster under your bed. The circumstances are extraordinary, yes, but the love is the same. Elizabeth wiped away her tears with a steady hand. Even if we believed you, and I'm not saying we do what happened during those 35 years. Why didn't you find a way back sooner? La Sierra de Niebla was isolated, controlled, he explained. Those who ruled it believed they had a sacred duty to collect and protect people who had crossed over, to keep them separate from this world. They feared what might happen if the boundaries between realities became too porous. He held up his scarred hands. I tried to escape many times. Each attempt was punished, each failure more demoralizing than the last. It wasn't until the younger generation rose up against the old order that any of us had a real chance at freedom. The intensity of his gaze, the evident sincerity in his voice, created an almost palpable energy in the small room. Abigail found herself wavering between skepticism and a strange, growing sense that perhaps, just perhaps, there was truth in this extraordinary tale. "Mom," she asked quietly, turning to Elizabeth, "what do you think?" Elizabeth studied the man's face for a long, silent moment. "I think," she finally said, "that either this man is James, somehow returned to us against all logic and science, or he believes he is, with such conviction that he knows things no one else could possibly know." She reached across the table, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, and placed her hand over his. "Either way, I need to understand. I need to hear everything." A knock at the door announced Daniel's return. "Time's up," he said gently, opening the door wider. "We need to process him for release or formal charging." "Release him," Elizabeth said firmly, rising to her feet. "This man has committed no crime." Daniel looked to Abigail, who nodded her agreement. "He came to us directly, made no public claims, sought no financial gain. There's no legal basis to hold him." "And then what?" Daniel asked pragmatically. "Where does he go? What happens next?" Elizabeth squared her shoulders, making a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. "He comes home with me. With us. Whatever the truth is, we're going to face it together. As a family." The man who called himself James Reynolds looked up at Elizabeth, his expression a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Lizzie, are you sure?" "No," she admitted with a small smile. "I'm not sure of anything anymore. But I am sure that I've spent 35 years wondering what happened to and I am not going to walk away from the possibility of an answer, no matter how impossible that answer might seem." Daniel, ever the protective husband and police chief, voiced his concerns. "Abby, Elizabeth, I understand the emotional pull here, but this is a stranger with an unverifiable story. Having him in your home, is our choice," Abigail finished firmly. "Besides, if he wanted to harm us, he's had ample opportunity. Whatever his true identity, his intentions seem genuine." The man stood, addressing Daniel directly. "Chief Callahan, I understand your concerns. They're valid and come from a place of care for your family. I give you my word that I mean no harm to Elizabeth or Abigail. But if my presence makes you uncomfortable, I'm willing to find other accommodations." Daniel studied him for a moment, then sighed in resignation. "No, if this is what they want, I won't stand in the way. But I will be keeping a close eye on the situation." He extended his hand in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself. "Just know that if anything happens to either of them, you'll hold me personally responsible," the man finished, shaking Daniel's hand firmly. "As you should. As I would, in your position." The formalities of release were completed quickly, and by noon, an extraordinary procession made its way through Port Haven, Elizabeth and Abigail Reynolds, flanked by the man claiming to be James, returning to the Reynolds family home for the first time in 35 years. News traveled fast in the small coastal town. By afternoon, neighbors were finding excuses to pass by the modest bungalow, curiosity piqued by the rumors already circulating. Frank Mahoney from the airport was among the first to arrive, bearing a bottle of whiskey and a lifetime of questions. "James?" he asked incredulously, standing on the porch as the door opened to reveal his long-lost friend, older, weathered but unmistakably similar to the man he had known decades earlier. "My God, is it really you?" "It's complicated, Frank," Elizabeth answered for him, ushering the airport manager inside. "We're still figuring it all out ourselves." Throughout the afternoon, a small stream of visitors arrived, old friends, colleagues from Elizabeth's support group, even Abigail's son, James Jr., hastily returned from university upon receiving his mother's cryptic phone call about a situation involving your grandfather. The young man stood in the living room doorway, staring at the stranger who bore his name and, undeniably, a strong resemblance to the photographs that had watched over him throughout his childhood. "This is weird," he finally said, with the blunt honesty of youth. "Are we sure he's really Grandpa?" "We're not sure of anything," Abigail admitted, placing a supportive hand on her son's shoulder. "But we're trying to keep an open mind." Young James approached the older man cautiously, studying him with unabashed curiosity. "So you're like, what, a time traveler? A clone? A doppelganger from another dimension?" The man smiled, appreciating the directness. The last one is closest, I suppose. Though I prefer to think of myself as simply James Reynolds, trying to find my way back to the life I lost. Cool, the younger James decided after a moment's consideration. Weird, but cool. Does this mean I should call you Grandpa? Let's start with James, the older man suggested gently, and see where things go from there. As evening approached, the visitors departed, leaving the core family, Elizabeth, Abigail, young James, and the man who might be James Sr., alone in the house filled with memories both shared and separate. They gathered on the back porch, the same porch where Elizabeth and James had once discussed adoption under a chorus of cicadas. The insects were singing again tonight, their pulsing rhythm a backdrop to the extraordinary conversation unfolding. I want to know everything, Elizabeth said, settling into her favorite chair. Every detail of the past 35 years. Where you were, what you experienced, how you survived. The man nodded, gathering his thoughts. It's a long story and parts of it will be hard to hear, but you deserve the whole truth, however strange it might seem. And so he began, his voice steady as he recounted the crash, the days adrift, the rescue by the strange vessel with its crew who spoke of doors between worlds. He described La Tierra de Niebla, a small island nation hidden in the mists of the Caribbean, isolated not just by geography but by choice, by belief, by fear of the outside world. The people there had a complex mythology about their homeland, he explained. They believed it existed at the intersection of multiple realities, that they were tasked with protecting those who had crossed over, preventing any disruption to the natural order. Those of us who had been collected were treated well enough, but never allowed to leave, never permitted contact with the outside world. A gilded cage is still a cage, Abigail observed. Exactly, he agreed. Though over time many came to accept their new reality, to build lives, their marriages, families, careers within the confines of their isolation. I never did. I couldn't let go of the thought of you, Lizzie, raising Abby alone, not knowing what had happened to me. Elizabeth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I never stopped looking for answers. Even after they declared you legally dead, even after the Coast Guard insisted there was no possibility of survival, I just, couldn't accept that you were gone without a trace. The revolution changed everything, he continued, describing how the younger generation, secretly connected to the outside world through smuggled technology, had begun questioning the isolationist policies of their leaders. It wasn't violent for the most part, more of a gradual collapse of authority. When the borders finally opened, those of us who wanted to leave formed a group. There were 12 of us at first, people from different times, different places, all trying to find our way home. Did they all make it? Young James asked, captivated by the tale. A shadow crossed the older man's face. Not all. Some were too old, too frail for the journey. Others discovered that the world they had left behind had changed too much, that there was nothing to return to. A few simply disappeared along the way. Perhaps they found doors back to their own realities, or perhaps, Dottable quotes, he didn't finish the thought. And the others? Abigail pressed. The ones who made it out with you? Scattered now, I imagine. Each following their own path home. He smiled ruefully. We agreed not to stay in contact. It seemed safer that way, less likely to draw attention. Though I've often wondered how Manuel fared in Spain, or if Eliza ever found her family in Australia. The conversation continued late into the night, with James answering questions, filling in details, painting a picture of a life lived in exile yet always oriented toward home. He spoke of working as a mechanic, later as a pilot for La Tierra's small fleet of aircraft, of learning the local customs while never fully integrating, of the few friendships he had formed and the many escape attempts he had made. The last attempt nearly killed me, he admitted, rolling up his sleeve to reveal a long, jagged scar that ran from wrist to elbow. I stole a fishing boat, tried to navigate by the stars, got caught in a storm about 20 miles offshore. They found me half-drowned, clinging to the wreckage. His expression darkened with the memory. After that, they kept me under close surveillance for years. No access to vehicles, boats, certainly not aircraft. Elizabeth reached out tentatively, her fingers tracing the scar on his arm. You never gave up, she said softly. All those years, all those failed attempts, and you never stopped trying to get back to us. How could I? He replied simply. You and Abby were my whole world. The thought of you was what kept me going through the darkest times. As midnight approached, exhaustion began to claim them all. The emotional intensity of the day, coupled with the sheer volume of information to process, had left them drained but somehow lighter, as if sharing the burden of this impossible story had distributed its weight among them. We should get some rest, Elizabeth suggested, rising from her chair. There's a guest room upstairs where you can sleep, James. The name still felt strange on her lips, addressed to this man who both was and wasn't her husband. He nodded gratefully. Thank you, Lizzie, for listening, for giving me a chance to explain. It's more than I dared hope for. Young James and Abigail prepared to leave for their own home, with promises to return in the morning. As they stepped onto the front porch, Abigail turned to her son. "What do you think?" she asked quietly, away from the others. "Do you believe him?" The young man considered the question seriously. "I think he believes it," he said finally. "And honestly, Mom, his story explains things that nothing else really can, like how he knows stuff only Grandpa would know." He shrugged with the remarkable adaptability of youth. "Maybe the world is weirder than we think. Maybe there are doors between different versions of reality. Who am I to say it's impossible?" Abigail smiled, marveling at her son's openness to possibilities she herself was still struggling to accept. "When did you get so wise?" "Must be genetic," he quipped, hugging her briefly before heading to the car. Inside the house, Elizabeth showed James to the guest room, a simple space kept ready for visitors who rarely came. He set his duffel bag on the bed, looking around with appreciation. "This is more than generous, considering the circumstances," he said. Elizabeth lingered in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "James, my James. Would have been 77 now," she said softly. "You look good for 77. A small smile touched his lips. Time works differently in La Tierra, or so they claimed. Something about the proximity to the thresholds between worlds. People aged more slowly there, especially those who had crossed over. Elizabeth nodded, accepting this explanation as readily as any other in a day filled with impossibilities. "Good night, then," she said, turning to leave. "Lizzie," he called after her. When she paused, looking back, he asked the question that had been on his mind since the moment he'd seen her again. "Are you happy? These past 35 years, have you found happiness? Despite everything?" She considered the question carefully. "I built a life," she said finally. "A good life, with purpose and meaning. I raised our daughter. I helped other families who had experienced losses like mine. I found ways to move forward." A hint of her old smile appeared. "Happiness comes and goes, but contentment that I found eventually." He nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and sadness. "I'm glad. You deserve every happiness, every joy." As she turned once more to leave, Elizabeth surprised them both by adding, "The photo albums are in the living room bookcase, if you want to catch up on what you missed." "Thank you," he said softly. "I'd like that very much." In the darkness of her own room, Elizabeth lay awake, her mind racing with thoughts and questions. Was this truly James, somehow returned to her through some inexplicable cosmic doorway? Or was he a stranger with an elaborate delusion who nevertheless knew things only James could know? And perhaps most importantly, did the answer even matter anymore? After 35 years of absence, could the void in her life ever truly be filled? Or had she, like the ancient ship of Theseus, replaced so many pieces of herself over time that the original vessel no longer existed? Down the hall, in the quiet of the guest room, James Reynolds saw. The man who believed himself to be James Reynolds sat surrounded by photo albums, tracing with gentle fingers the life he had missed. Abigail's high school graduation, her college years, her wedding to Daniel, the birth of young James, birthdays, Christmases, ordinary moments captured in photographs that told the story of a family that had continued without him, that had built lives around the absence he had left behind. Tears streamed down his face as he turned page after page, witnessing in still images the years he had lost, the milestones he had missed, the moments that could never be recaptured. Yet beneath the grief was a profound gratitude for the resilience of the family he had left behind, for their willingness to hear his impossible story, and for the chance, however belated, to be part of their lives again. In separate rooms, separated by more than just walls, Elizabeth and James both pondered the same question as sleep finally claimed them. Could a broken family, fractured by time and space and the mysteries of the Bermuda Triangle, ever truly be made whole again? The answer would not come easily or quickly. It would emerge gradually in the days and weeks and months to come, through small moments of connection and lingering doubts, through scientific tests and emotional truths, through the complex dance of people trying to reconcile the impossible with the reality they had always known. But for tonight, in the quiet darkness of the Reynolds home, an extraordinary possibility hung in the air, that sometimes, against all odds and logic, the lost could be found, the vanished could return, and the broken could begin to heal not as they once were, perhaps, but in new and unexpected ways that honored both what had been lost and what remained. Outside the window, the stars shone brightly over Port Haven, the same stars that had guided sailors and pilots through the mysterious waters of the Bermuda Triangle for centuries. And somewhere among them, perhaps, were other doors, other thresholds between worlds, other possibilities waiting to be discovered by those brave or desperate or fortunate enough to pass through. For in a universe vast enough to contain parallel realities and doors between worlds, perhaps the most miraculous possibility of all was this, that love, in all its forms, could transcend even the boundaries between dimensions, carrying us home when all other navigational instruments had failed.